in this episode.
One thing I really disagree with in the culture wars is calling people who've gone to university elites. Because in fact, it actually buys into the logic of capitalism, where there is a distinction between lumpenized professionals and lumpenized, everybody else. Because in reality, and I think this is what emancipation is politically, is to recognize our universal position relative to the lack in subjectivity and relative to capital.
Correct.
So one of the things that I think is interesting and that there's a potential with Luigi is that if you go on any sort of Reddit forum, what is really surprising is universally, people are recognizing something in this moment. So, I don't know if you saw this meme, but, immediately Ben Shapiro was saying, how awful Luigi's thing is. And his followers are like, fuck you, Ben, actually, da 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 da. So whether you agree with the tactics of this man or not, there is something where people from, it's difficult to, I don't think the words left and right culturally actually philosophically hold water. So, but across the cultural spectrum, people with different political positions are recognizing something together. And I think that's an emancipatory moment.
Hey everyone, welcome to this conversation with the filmmaker and writer Helen Rollins. This is the second conversation between Helen and I, and I'd say it's more of a follow-up from the previous one. And the reason being because even though I was quite familiar with Helen's work, during the first conversation, I hadn't read Helen's new book, Psychocinema, because it wasn't out yet. And now, finally, I did devour this book, as you can see from the tabs. And the reason for that was because, well, firstly, I just thought it was a well-written book with succinctness and brevity. But at the same time, given it's bringing together film and psychoanalysis, I thought it was an utter delight to read this book. And I should say this, I'm really going to be embarrassing Helen in this introduction today. Normally, when people that aren't as obsessed with theory the way I am, or some of us who, are in this world are, when they ask for, what's all this theory thing, Hegel, Zizek, lack, contradiction, what's all this stuff about? I'm curious, but also I don't know where to start. There are a few places I point people towards, certain blog posts, certain lectures, or even recommend certain books. And some of the books are, Emancipation after Hegel by Tom McGovern, of course, the book by Zizek on violence. If you're into more theory, probably Adrian Johnston's work. And now I think I'm going to start recommending this book, Psychocinema 2, for people interested in any kind of theory, because I really do think it's a fantastic introductory source to attune oneself with this sort of theory and philosophy, because yes, philosophy, it's an umbrella term that encapsulates a lot. The field itself really can't be defined that this is what it's doing in some sense. And so if one's interested in a certain way of thinking and a certain way of viewing the world and viewing reality, a good place to start is almost in a credulous way, I'd say, simply accept what a school of thought or these group of thinkers are theorizing about and just take it all in and kind of fall into that language game, throw oneself into that. And I think a book like Psychocinema is a perfect place to start because it's deeply penetrable and readable. Some of these texts can be virtually impossible to read, so you got to start somewhere, and I think a book like this is a good place to start from. But that being said, to continue on embarrassing Helen, I've got to say, Helen really is becoming one of my favorite guests to have on the podcast, even though she's only been on 2 times. And I think one reason for that is because, yes, there's no denying the fact, sorry, I've got a bit of a sore throat today. There's no denying the fact that the themes that Helen touches on, they are quite ghastly and lugubrious. When she discusses neoliberal subjectivity and living on a capitalism, when we see the world right now, with the rise of the far right, with the climate crisis, with the just almost obscene amounts of inequality. I think I saw somewhere that now Elon Musk's net worth is over $400 billion. So we're going to have our first trillionaire soon. We're going to the kind of the feudal era, as those like Yanis Varoufakis has theorized. And seeing this world we live in, and then also at the same time, on a personal note, I'm 27 years old, and for the longest time, I never even considered this or thought about this. But probably when I'm 30 or 31, I'd like to have a family, and you really do start questioning if it's worth bringing more life into a world like this. So there are all these questions that lingers one's mind, and in fact haunts one like a specter in some sense. But then the way Helen speaks of it, without any kind of cheap optimism or any kind of wishful thinking, by connecting it to kind of this universal subjectivity and making it a universal project towards, and indeed, emancipation, there's something almost cathartic in that. There's something where it's to use Zizek's term, where you find courage in the hopelessness. And honestly, I think that's what's a worthwhile project. I mean, as academics, as people who think, doing something like that, it's a worthy thing. And reading this book, certainly, it's a very political book too. So it did show us how emancipation, if we are to speak of emancipation in any way, it has to be a universalist project, as certainly people like Todd McGovern has really highlighted in their work. And on that note, I should also mention the topic of Luigi came up, so I'll let you be the judge of whether it was worthwhile discussing this whole Luigi thing or if it was mere spectacle. Anyway, okay, I'll stop, Helen. I'll stop embarrassing you. So be that as it may, now, as per usual, a quick PSA. You may be aware that I've mentioned multiple times I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. I simply don't have anything to sell you, and I deeply do believe that we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you more things. That being said, though, forgive the tautology. We ultimately live in the world we live in, and I can't continue this project and sustain it if I don't have any kind of financial support. So as uncomfortable as this makes me feel, I sincerely would like to ask you to consider supporting this podcast financially. Needless to state, your listenership and viewership is more than enough support. However, if you have the means, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, Substack, or even PayPal. And if you're wondering what are the perks, what are you going to get? Nothing. Absolutely nothing, because I'm not selling you anything. You're not buying anything, but rather, if this podcast, if the work I've done has brought you any kind of value, if you've learned something new, do consider supporting me on these platforms, but to reiterate, only if you have the means. Alright, back to the episode. Helen Rollins is a writer and filmmaker from Northern Ireland, currently based between Belfast and London. She studied modern languages and literature at Cambridge and the ENS de Lyon. She lectures in philosophy, film, and psychoanalysis, and is the author of the book Psychocinema, which reexamines the connection between psychoanalysis and film. And now, here's my conversation with Helen Rollins. Gonna start with like a nerdy theory question, but to do
Okay.
something a bit interesting, obviously, as leftists, at the end of the day,
Yeah.
we're interested in emancipation, right? Whatever that
Yeah.
means, that's kind of the
Yeah.
interested in. And
Yeah.
certainly, yeah, in fact, I think it's in the section where you talk on political film, and
Okay.
you write on this film 2 days, 1 night, and this idea of
Mm.
how does one become a political subject?
Mm.
And something that's kind of been on the news recently is the United Health
Luigi.
Luigi. You know it, yeah.
Yeah,
So I mean,
I knew it.
and like I've been thinking a lot about like,
Yeah.
of course, right? I mean, Benjamin recently on the Wild Left podcast, he was like, "Oh, look, this is just spectacle. There really isn't. This isn't really an event in the Badooian sense." And
Yeah.
perhaps it's right because like, yeah, I was reading this thing on Badu. Like Badu never thought that 9/11, for instance, was an event. For him, that wasn't an
Yeah.
event. Like there wasn't
Yeah.
a shift in the symbolic order. There wasn't something new that came out of it. Um,
Mhm.
but then at the same time, you kind of write a lot in the book on this notion that a part of what cinema does is seeing, yes, your your lack, one's
Mhm.
ontological lack, but also the contradiction of society, of reality as such.
Yeah.
And I think what's really interesting about Luigi, and maybe I'm completely misanalyzing this here, is that
there is some kind of contradiction where he's like this tech bro, he doesn't seem like a political person at all. He's not like a leftist radical, or he's just like a
Mhm.
tech guy who comes from a really rich family who took the anger and directed it towards, well, in my opinion, the right symbolic figure, which
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
insurance company, I mean, the devil incarnate. But so in this notion of like becoming a political
Yeah.
subject, this isn't really a question, but more like, yeah, how are you what's your vibe on the whole Luigi situation?
Luigi.
Yeah,
Do you
yeah.
know, it's funny, I was just at a birthday party and discussing this very thing because the girl whose birthday it was really fancies Luigi, And it's interesting because in terms of like the mediatized moment, he is very conventionally handsome. What do you call it?
Good looking bloke, yeah,
Well,
100%.
there's a term for it with it. Regulation hottie, maybe is what you
Oh,
would call
I don't
him.
know
Like
what that is. You're more than I am. I have got no idea what that means.
I've heard this term regulation hottie. I've heard it mean different things, but apparently it means just like standard issue, like not, maybe Johnny Depp or something, but he's definitely like
Decent looking.
um
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
he's a good looking guy. But also in terms of the spectacle, the other thing that was, really amazing, and you referenced 9/11, and I sometimes think this is probably quite a crazy thing to say, but in terms of like as an art piece or as an art project, you'd really it's quite an impressive visual event. And just that footage of Luigi, I mean, I don't know if he knew, it obviously seemed very well planned. And I think people were quite shocked when it came out, who he was, and he was just found in this McDonald's. And the people, there was all this sort of doubt online, that's not really him, because it seemed like, he was not only just this Robin Hood figure, but like actually a sort of like sniper, because the way he did, carry out the killing was quite. I just been watching this show, The Jackal, that's been on in the UK. I don't know if it's been on in America, but it's sorry, in Australia, but it's a very compelling, media product. And obviously, I think he had planned to have his Monopoly money in this backpack. So there's all these sorts of different reasons why it's so captivating. And I can imagine that Benjamin's probably a bit skeptical about it. I mean, in some ways, you could say, you would hope that this isn't something where we can enjoy at arm's length a sort of performance of emancipation that is sort of a release valve where we feel like something's being done.
Like
But I
catharsis.
think
Yeah.
a catharsis. But I think something that I find kind of interesting, and this is where I see political emancipation taking place, potentially quite at odds with what has been the received wisdom about what a left-wing politics is. And I think it's to do with a material structure of our society that's very much to do with this moment in time. In the last sort of 10 years or so, there's been a real sort of reflex to call people Nazis or crypto fascists or crypto communists or whatever, whoever you disagree with. And of course, Nazism is a movement, a right-wing fascist movement that emerged in Middle Europe in the 1930s, a very specific time. And this appeal to casting out people who you disagree with certain epithets where it's beyond the pale and it can't be even tarried with as a symptom, even if, let's say, someone's politics aren't good, but there's something to be assessed there, that speaks to an aspect of our utopic capitalist logic where instead of tarrying with the contradictions politically and thinking universally, we have to create and erect absolute monsters or sort of scapegoats behind whom we can imagine there is a reality where capitalism functions, and this reality is contingently bad, and the absolute enemy that we can cast out with certain epithets, like, so for the right, they might say crypto communist. And you hear these words like neo-Marxist, which is hilarious because often what is claimed to be a neo-Marxist position is actually, I would say, a highly capitalist position, often like, let's say, the left wing of capital, but nothing to do with Marx at all. But this sort of logic is actually part of the capitalist bad infinity. Interestingly, so I think what has happened, and one of the ways in which capitalism devolves, as Marx points out in Capital, is that the rate of profit tends to decline. So the rate of profit tends to decline because of automation, he says. Because in capitalism, profit is really generated from labor value. So the amount of work that's put into, so work essentially. When you have a collapsing rate of profit, and if you look this up online, it's kind of crazy because obviously we have huge inequality and what seems like, and it is true, like rampant capitalism. This is sort of a weird contradiction in capitalism that I think needs to be sort of explicated more clearly. You look at sort of graphs and like the global rate of profit is like 0. And so you think like, well, how is this working? How is it still going on? But Marx points out that there are things called countervailing tendencies, where capitalism, when the rate of profit falls so low, finds different ways to extract value and keep the profit going. And often today, this is the thing that's really sad, because I see, and I could be wrong, that, let's say Marx is right, and the next stage of after capitalism and social order is socialism, that perhaps socialism, and we've had aspects of socialism already, are the moments when we are able to organize society to redistribute a surplus value. And that might head towards a communal ownership of the means of production, something like communism. So we sort of suppose, and really to allow society to function at a certain point because of this rate of profit and the conundrums that result from it, governments need to do socialism. But what they have ended up doing, especially, and I think 2008 is a real sign of this, but this was actually only possible because it was perhaps a trend that was already occurring, but it's happening absolutely crazily now. And the UK is so guilty of this, is a state-sponsored corporate socialism. So it looks like socialism, it looks like redistribution, but in fact, it's a bailout economy where workers' money is being used as the very thing to maintain the profits of the corporations. There are other countervailing tendencies. So you have a tendency towards monopolies. So it's impossible for all corporations to have to get the value. So you see this in tech, you have this race towards being the monopolistic entity, like with Uber, and actually this introduction of illegal business practices that were sort of outlawed under Theodore Roosevelt with like the antitrust laws and stuff. But you also have this exploitation of young people in a society that can't offer roles with something that people have called it different things, but basically the commoditization of education, taking people out of the workforce because there aren't enough jobs for them for several years, allowing people to buy into the logic of exception, which is precisely the ideology of capitalism, backing ourselves, going to university, paying tens of thousands of pounds or dollars for that education. But, and in the UK especially, we had these policies under New Labour, and this well-known, he's just passed away, John Prescott, the education secretary, had a northern accent, and he would say, education, education, education. So this was the notion that you could actually just maintain capitalism, and instead of dealing with the economic circumstances that eventually impoverish the many for the few, part of the one of the countervailing tendencies of the global rate, the rate of profit declining, is monopoly logic. You have to find all these different ways to sort of like pretend to try to put out the fire in the long term, or to sort of buy capitalism's continuation. But capitalism is always impoverishing the many for the few. So instead of rethinking the economy to work out like, okay, why don't we have enough jobs for people? You think, oh, you can just get there by educating people. But of course, any promise can be commoditized. And unless you're transforming the material conditions, you're just perpetuating the system. And you see this with all sorts of apparently emancipatory logics that are taken on by the market that allow us to believe we are heading towards socialism, when in fact we are having a greater, the culture wars themselves are a highly commoditizable series of events that take place. Huge amounts of labor takes place, unpaid and unrecognized, through, online activities, through affect culture, things like this. But we have basically, and this is something that we have seen very many times throughout history, lots of people who have distinguished themselves at great personal cost and great personal sacrifice through education. It could have been all sorts of different, and I'm very, very pro-education. I really like philosophy. The issue is this sort of commoditized education and using education as a means to mystify and perpetuate exploitation of the many. So you have a thrust towards this perfectionistic, goal-orientated, apparently you can distinguish yourself through the accumulation of degrees, commodity logic. And this also commodity logic, this logic of exception, has infiltrated the neoliberal university. And there's a question as to how this has affected the kind of things we learn about today. And also this utilitarian attempt to utilitarianize the university towards like being employable. But of course, as we all know, the more people who have degrees, the less value they have. So we have this moment where, in fact, in the UK, there was a recent study just done where the average graduate earns less now than the average non-graduate and has huge amounts of debt. Benjamin Studebaker was talking the other day at a talk I was at about how the average graduate, okay, we have, of course, the exception. So we have a difference between rump professionals, he calls them, people who have done the degrees and are now the managers of capital, and it's worked out for them. I mean, has it obviously alienated in weird ways through that kind of work, and it would be really depressing, I think. But then you have this lumpenized mass of surplus graduates. And this is a real tragedy. And when in history you've had moments where this kind, and not just in capitalism, but in a sort of surplus of, people, one thing I really disagree with in the culture wars is calling people who've gone to university elites. Because in fact, it actually buys into the logic of capitalism, where there is a distinction between lumpenized professionals and lumpenized, everybody else. Because in reality, and I think this is what emancipation is politically, is to recognize our universal position relative to the lack in subjectivity and relative to capital.
Correct.
So one of the things that I think is interesting, and that there's a potential with Luigi, is that if you go on any sort of Reddit forum, what is really surprising is universally, people are recognizing something in this moment. So, I don't know if you saw this meme, but, immediately Ben Shapiro was saying, how awful Luigi's thing is. And his followers are like, fuck you, Ben, actually, da, 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 da. So whether you agree with the tactics of this man or not, there is something where people from, it's difficult to, I don't think the words left and right culturally actually philosophically hold water. So, but across the cultural spectrum, people with different political positions are recognizing something together. And I think that's an emancipatory moment. But where I think something reactionary and difficult can occur is often in movements. And some could argue that the Luigi killing, right? So Luigi is, it's an interesting position because, by the way, one thing that I think really speaks to a truth about politics is people have written sort of think pieces about how this guy's politics were so confused, but it's actually the average person doesn't fit neatly in some, A equals A equals A equals A, this, then this, and this, and this. We think in complex and contradictory ways. We all have a mix of weird experiences in our lives where we might believe some things about this issue and some things about this. Our personal experience about poverty in this way makes us believe that. There's all sorts of different ways where we are sort of in a total sort of cloud of mystery in terms of politics. And I think this attempt to tribalize and turn into silos the political is precisely the logic of capital. But historically, often it is the surplus offspring of aristocrats that can cause openings, political openings, but often that turn reactionary. And the reason I say that is because one thing that's really traumatic for people, especially if you think of the average graduate, and I see this so much in the arts that I work in. My husband's an academic. You see this as so many people have PhDs and there just are not the roles. And it's absolutely tragic. It's the lack of human care to have created this sort of system where, again, there's contingent factors like millennials and younger being the offspring of the richest generation in history. What's next? The promise of exception, a child who has a job, or not even a job, a role beyond the constraints of capital. And this is what we all sort of hope for. But there just aren't those positions, not least because how can everybody be Martin Scorsese, But also because the economy has collapsed. There's one statistic I saw. It's difficult to comment on statistics because you see all these different things and they're like a snapshot of one aspect. But somewhere I saw a statistic, something like that in terms of the collapse, the rapidity of the collapse in economic prospects from the boomer generation to the millennial. I don't know if it was looking at one country in particular, has not been seen since the Black Death. So this is insane. But what can happen is, and I think I mentioned this in the book, in terms of the logic of exception, fantasy, the more precarious we are, the more anguish we experience, the more we invest in fantasy. And fantasy is what makes life worth living. I sometimes see some kind of more, let's say, nihilistic philosophers who are like, it's all shit, life's all shit, it's lack, it's shit. But actually, lack in reality is what makes life worth living because it engenders desire. And desire and fantasy are like the lifeblood of subjectivity, and it makes life worth living. But of course, there is such thing as the reality principle, and we have to be able to tarry with it. But often we are able to tarry with the reality principle at moments when we feel more secure. But when we have an investment in fantasy or a lot of investment in exception, and our entire subjectivity is tied up in this logic of being the exception. My husband and I actually wrote we haven't done anything with it, but a sort of dark comedy, very sympathetic to the main character, movie that one day, who knows, we might be able to make, called The Glass Graduate, based on a Cervantes short story. And Cervantes was writing sort of like 16th century or something like that, maybe, yeah. 1500s, potentially 1600s in Spain. So, this is an era that was completely different, but it's really interesting reading this short story about this. Basically, a guy who goes to university and starts to believe he's made out of glass. But if your whole childhood has been operationalized towards a promise of the logic of exception, and you've worked really hard and you've paid for it, to give up on that image of yourself, one would rather die often. And you've seen, if you look at Benjamin Studebaker had a really good analysis of the 2019 election in the UK in terms of Jeremy Corbyn and other moments where we had these sort of socialistic, interesting moments. But how it was precisely often in a class, a non-emancipatory desire to not recognize oneself as a universal proletarianized subject, because it's too painful. And often you have a casting of people you don't agree with. And this happens in many different ways. You often have people who maybe aren't of that position thinking, and I don't want to predict into people's minds, but what kind of crazy cultural nonsense do these people who went to university believe in? And on the other hand, I've heard people, many of my contemporaries who go to university, who call normal working people who maybe haven't had the same life experiences as them. And not because they're, terrible people, just don't have those experiences and those tastes and what have you, and are called often by those who don't want to acknowledge actually the shared material position as things like mouth breathers. In Britain, we use the term gammon, which is, I think, quite an offensive kind of term, when in reality, we are all, and increasingly so, subjects of capital. Who, and one of the statistics that Ben was talking about last week was the average graduate, not including the rump professionals who've managed to secure a place in a professional managerial class, earns the equivalent of what a labourer or a sort of a working class person, for instance, in the 1970s would have earned. But in the 1970s, you had a more socialized economy. Sometimes, obviously, there were fewer scientific advancements in different ways, but you had, a better funded, let's say, National Health Service. It was easier to get a house, and if you were in a normal heterosexual relationship, you could have a number of children, and your wife didn't have to work. Now we have two graduates, let's say the standard couple, who have spent a lot of money on student debt. They have been out of the workforce for many years, and now they can expect to have a similar salary to a labourer in the 1970s, but they both have to work. And those socialized services are increasingly getting underfunded and privatized, or are because of capital mobility as well. So the extremely rich find ways to mitigate against the collapsing rate of profit by moving their money around, not paying tax. The thing that's actually crazy is you think, oh, the global rate of profit being zero means rich people don't have money. It's actually a motivation to actually find more and more and more ways to keep the money, and you actually get a monopolistic system. So this is how, the contradiction itself generates more contradiction.
Contradiction, yeah.
So then you have, the living standard and what people can, you see it all sorts of different ways. People, and maybe it'll get to a point, and I do think, there's different aspects in terms of where you can read things in Marx, that like being a worker puts you in a position where not only are you aware of the excesses of capital, but you're able to enact collective bargaining if you have control on supply chains. But obviously in the way that our economy works now, that's difficult because we're not in sort of productive roles in a sort of material sense where we're working at a factory or something like that. But there is sort of this hope that people will come to recognize their shared material interest, but the subjective destitution, it's much easier to scapegoat and to say, oh, it's the reason for my poverty is, let's say, an immigrant or something, or the reason for my poverty is this group of people who don't agree with me, and if only they stop voting this way, then. And the thing is, as Zizek points out, I think quite brilliantly, you can be a hypochondriac and have cancer. You can be toxically jealous of your partner and they're still cheating. So you look at someone like Trump, and so you could say people have voted for Trump and it's a symptom of something. But in many ways, Trump is as bad as people fear him to be. You look at, obviously there was this video that was put out by Trump and his team after the election. It's all about togetherness and unity and stuff. But again, capitalism really loves to use false universals to promise, because as an ideological foil for the fact that it's the most individualistic, exploitative, exclusionary, subjugatory logic. And then often what people do, which is really difficult, is they'll critique the ideological force, or they'll critique the false universal, and then return to more individualism. And you see this with sort of identity politics in all sorts of different ways. When in reality, we want more of the universal, not the false universal, because the universal, actually, if we're thinking about how lack is the underpinning of, potentially from this sort of perspective, the universe subjectivity, and is in reality, as much as capitalism tries to deny that fact. So the trouble is and something that I think is really shocking is when we actually see the sort of the people that Trump's appointed. So like the richest man in history. This is absolutely fucking crazy, right?
It's ridiculous. So-called populist precedent. Yeah, and like all neocons, people that were part of the military industrial complex. Yeah, it's to a point where that's the irony here. It's like it is absurd and bizarre. I forget where I read this, Helen. I'm sure you've come across it. It's a famous quote where the author goes, now we go to art for reality because reality itself is full of fictions. As in, it's like in postmodern modernity. As Frederick Jameson, capitalism is the postmodern logic, really.
Yeah.
Reality itself is full of fictions that we go to art for something real, So, and then Trump's appointments, it's ridiculous. And then here's where, again, I come back to this notion of psychoanalytic theory. And again, as you point out, how cinema does the same thing. And then the libidinal economy, because I think still, and everything you said, certainly, it's like a very, you can rationally make sense of it in this conversation. But then, of course, one can't help wonder how in the world do people vote for their own subjugation, for their own. It's almost like this self-flagellation. And I guess that's where the libido comes in as to how enjoyment works.
Yeah, so the thing, I guess there's this question of, does death drive win out over an acceptance of reality?
Yeah.
This is what is, I would say, quite worrying about capitalism, right? So other forms of society that have happened in the past, every form of society is managing contradiction in different ways. And
Right.
there's all sorts of oppressive logics that are taking place. But sometimes you hear about certain things from past orders of society which seem quite sensible that we don't have. So somebody was mentioning about, how criminals were sort of shamed in medieval periods and stuff like this. Obviously, this is not to excuse, because these societies have all sorts of issues in their own way, and things like the promise of heaven just over the horizon to suffer through life. These are really horrible. But you can understand how people sort of required these logics to sort of keep going. The thing with capitalism is, as Marx points out in the Communist Manifesto, everything that is sacred is profaned. Capitalism will get rid of everything, just everything, for profit. It'll get rid of community, shared experiences, love, family, traditions, all these things that potentially, when we are living in community with other people, precisely because, and this is where we become a political subject. So, you can argue that politics is to do with, as soon as there are two or more people in a community, each person, no matter what similar background they come from, because of this is, the logic of psychoanalysis, because of the nature of contradiction, subjectivity, and we can sort of explode out in many different directions in terms of our desires and things. So they're always in contradiction with themselves and contradiction with each other. So we have to manage those mismatched desires in terms of the possession of the commons. So as soon as you have two or more people, you have to negotiate reality with other people. And I think there is an aspect where, when we live in community, we have to tarry with our desires and the desires of others. And I guess this is like the basic civilization, right? And I think that there's, this is something where Marx, as Freud points out in Civilization is Discontents, there's something you have to give up. And, at certain points, he's very depressive about it and critical of it. But then I think later in his career, he's actually sort of, and Lacan himself is much more kind of conservative, let's just say. But one of the issues with capitalism, and as I say, desire, fantasy, these make life worth living. This is the most important force in the universe. For people to give up on what, and I say this is, I find people boring who give up on their desire. I like fantasists. I like people who just won't take no for an answer, who will go for it, who will, but when capitalism does a very good job of getting us to forget that other people exist. Lacan has a statement about love. Love is giving what you don't have to somebody who doesn't want it. I think that's a really multiplicitous statement and can be taken in loads of different directions. But one way I sort of interpret it as is, one has fantasies, especially in our era where we are so in need and we have a very commoditized love market in terms of with dating apps and stuff like that. And we imagine all of us good, desirous millennials who watch too much Bridget Jones growing up, we imagine that there's some guy who can come along or some girl who can come along and not only fulfill us in our desire, our sexual desire, our, how we want to design our life, but also they can take away our precarity. But love really, in a certain sense, as Lacan says, is giving what you don't have to somebody who doesn't want it. As soon as you come up against another person, they can never fulfill this singular fantasy that we have come up with from a very early age, unless we're extremely lucky. But then actually, psychoanalytically, this would be the worst luck possible. Because if we got everything we wanted, we'd actually be confronted with the dark heart of the void at the heart of resistance, of existence, lack itself. You'd be, this is a very sort of psychotic position, quite melancholic. It's what happens often. Well, I mean, we can talk about mourning in a separate, in a way, because it's kind of quite interesting the way that Freud delineates confrontation with lack through the process of mourning. But it would be a disaster because it's precisely the not having that keeps desire alive. So in love, the other person can never give us precisely what we want. But what they give us in not giving us what we have is the continuation of fantasy. So it's giving what you don't have. So you don't have the perfect fulfillment of this person's random fantasy that emerges at a very early age based on various life situations. And that person doesn't want it, but actually, my friend Peter has a really good, sort of description of the friendship. You have those like love necklaces that you put together and they like join perfectly. You don't want that, you want one that's sort of slightly askew. And then love is negotiating. We might be caught up in romance. Tom McGowan writes about this really well in Capitalism, Desire, the difference between love and romance. But, the logic of romance is the logic of sort of Pretty Woman, where we have this guy. It's very narcissistic. It's not about the other person at all. It's about this commodity thing that can transcendentally fill the void in our existence, like a pair of Nike trainers. But in confronting another person, and this is where love is really political, you encounter the contradictory status of their subjectivity that they are lacking as well. And you build something through that, and you continue to enjoy fantasy precisely because there's something missing. And I think the thing is, in capitalism, everything will be commoditized eventually unless we, can come to terms with how this is not actually good. Because as you pointed out, if you got everything you wanted, you'd be confronted with the void of your existence. And in fact, you never can get exactly what you want. And this is one of the reasons why capitalism is so persistent, because it's precisely in its failing that it succeeds.
Yeah.
We can talk about that in a second. But but I think the issue with Death Drive is so Death Drive. Okay, so it's not necessarily death itself, but let's say a sustaining, when one so strongly holds towards the promise of oneness in fulfillment, or oneness in transcendence, or the transcendence of an object, one must always sustain lack by not getting it.
Mm-hmm.
So the trouble is, what we want to do is to direct this impulse to our benefit rather than to our detriment. I mean, there's ways of explaining that probably in like clearer ways.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think this is your kind of, in some almost like a performative way, demonstrating why we need cinema. Because you see, again, this is when I was reading this book here, right? Like, I mean, the theory stuff, yes, I've read this everywhere. I get what you're saying, but how can we house this contradiction? How can we, in an affective sense, to use a term in cognitive science or in neuroscience, help someone to confront this contradiction and house it, and not trying to overcome it because it's insurmountable, but rather learn to live with it. Because one way that I see Death Drive, it's I think Adrian Johnson, he writes on this beautifully, and I kind of like his, because he kind of like sometimes writes like an analytic philosopher, and for some reason,
it's good,
like that, and that it's like this almost like ontological force that just keeps going in like a meaningless, almost like stupid way, that it has no regard even to the subject. It's just like it just keeps going. So which is why it becomes self-destructive, and can be directed death drive. And perhaps this is something that has to be done communally. Maybe it certainly can't. In fact, probably the fantasy of capitalism is that you can kind of control it, do it on your own, and you kind of privatize it in some sense. And can be directed towards something more emancipatory, but not emancipatory towards like the idyllic place, because that itself is a fantasy, but rather this constant overcoming of contradiction. And I think I don't know. So another example like we can use here to kind of demonstrate this is I've been thinking a lot about self-help books. like it's unbelievable. I work in tech, so I'm software engineer.
Yeah, yeah.
Like are in tech companies, they want to try and be like all hip and cool, and so they got like libraries in the office, and
Mhm.
half the books are engineering books, which is great, of course, you need it, but the other half are like self-help, management, leadership books.
Yeah,
And then I find them so like, I mean, almost like they even kind of like obnoxiously annoying. Like some of the
yeah.
other books kind of sell them stuff to you. It's like it's so condescending, to be honest. It's patronizing. And I think the reason self-help books work is because they don't. Like the
No,
fact
absolutely.
they never in fact help you. And that's
Yeah,
exactly
exactly.
why there's so much pull towards them.
No,
Um,
this is really such a trick in capitalism that's really there's a few examples that I think delineate this really well. So the dating app Hinge uses
oh,
the
you should.
slogan designed to be deleted. And it's like, well, if it was designed to be deleted, you wouldn't have a very good product
Yeah.
because we'd use it one. So, historically, let's just say we can argue, and capitalism has some examples where this, is the logic where you basically have this logic of competition where people are offering different products and the best product wins. So the one that does the best job at doing something, and then you have a sort of progress narrative where, right, you've completed that task, you've got everybody matched with their perfect partner, and now you do, another the next thing. But of course, we don't live in that reality. And the dating app relies on I mean, when you I don't know you there's I know a few people who dating apps have worked for, and actually they tended to have met very early on. I don't know if that's a trend or what, but I do sort of see like the statistic on it working is so low, and also that this is potentially the exception that proves the rule, because of course you can roll a double six in reality. Sometimes something random happens and it works even though it shouldn't. So designed to be deleted. I mean, we know this is it's designed to keep us hooked on the process of looking for love so that we can keep investing in not only the performance and the labor of creating profiles and swiping. This is somewhere where we have loads of unrecognized labor in capitalism, is so value is extracted from us and we're not paid every time we post something online, every time we create a reel, every time we get engaged in things online. Another example I think is really interesting is one that I've stolen from a friend. So apologies to this friend, she knows who she is. But basically, her father was an NHS dentist in the UK and is in his 70s now. And when he retired, his NHS practice was only valued at £2,000, precisely because he was such a good dentist that there was no market for expensive treatments to improve the teeth of the people in his local area. So if he had been a terrible dentist and had undermined everybody's health, he would have been able to sell his practice for a profit. And obviously, this is where the commercialization of healthcare in America is absolutely batshit. So a movie that I refer to in the book is the movie Brazil, which is to do with this futuristic corporation, which basically the villain of the piece is played by Robert De Niro, who is a handyman who actually goes around fixing people's broken appliances, which the corporation can never fix because it has to have a reason in this bad infinity sense to keep going. And he's an outlaw because he actually goes and fixes things. So this is really the logic of capitalism, where it kind of ends up at a certain point. So it has to destroy to maintain profit, to maintain something, to fix a problem solution logic. In the problem solution logic, you always need a problem. So we were talking about death drive. So it's actually this utilitarian, bad infinity, perpetual forward movement, progress narrative that relies on destruction and death drive to it is precisely in the denial of death drive where it's really, really toxic. In terms of film, I mean, I have a sort of form of film specifically that I think is really promising in terms of getting people to in a really libidinal sense. I mean, Freud says, that you can't rationalize your way to the cure. And this is one of the reasons why I think the encounter, like in the psychoanalytic encounter that one goes through transference and countertransference with a practitioner, is something that actually we can see take place in film potentially for various different reasons. And in fact, I don't think this is like a radical thing to say. I think like psychoanalysis or the encounter, the therapeutic encounter, can take place in all sorts of ways at all times when we have conversations with people. And I think that film has a capacity to put us in a certain position. And this is to do with, we could argue, the contingent way it has developed as a technology, the period of time it emerged in, to do with the rise of 20th century capitalism, how it plays on our desire. It gets us going in a very libidinal way. It uses rich sounds, acting, characters on screen that we can have this transferential relationship with. Through the history of sort of the Hollywood golden age, we imagine that these are sort of whole and complete beings from which we can kind of learn something. Like as we go into the psychoanalytic encounter, we imagine that the psychoanalyst knows, something more than we do.
Correct.
And of course, this is the issue. Exactly, but this is a misguided belief, but this is what is necessary for transference to occur, only to be let down. It's only we can be let down once we've gone all the way. There's a passage in the book about this idea that many people have said, many theologians and many philosophers, that only a Christian can be an atheist, only by giving ourselves over all the way to belief, to the belief that our fantasy can assuage us, can we get to the point of being exposed to the lack in that reality. So I think film puts us in a position, precisely the kinds of films that explore and exploit desire, often maybe controversially, you're not supposed to say this in literary theory, very plotted, in some ways formulaic films, but those that allow for and this can happen in all sorts of different ways at different points of the narrative, not for a full logic of closure, but one that actually exposes the lack in that which we have been invested in throughout the whole process of watching the film. There's loads of films that do this in the history of cinema. And I think, in fact, the ones that really stand the test of time are the ones that, in fact, have done this precisely because they speak to a universal that is so compelling, and they reflect back to us something about our subjectivity that is so true. And we have, films, I think I mentioned in the book, films like Citizen Kane does this really kind of interestingly. A recent film, Pig, does this in an absolutely brilliant way.
I watched it after I read the book. Excellent.
Did you?
Yeah,
it's a really, really good film.
He was doing movies, because he took a break, or he was doing like some really bad ones because of his financial troubles. But this was fantastic. Yeah.
It was really fantastic. And also, I know how the film industry is at a really difficult moment precisely because of what has happened in terms of, as we said, the global rate of profit, the sort of way it has become a tech commodity through the streaming platforms and stuff. And if you look at different periods of time when actually the industry was flush with money, years like 1998, it's amazing how many really brilliant films were made at that time. And now it's very difficult. There's a huge amount of risk aversion, which is interesting because at a certain time there was quite a lot of VC money. So you'd kind of, as basically there was this rush to be the singular streamer that dominated them all. And if you look at the statistics on how much money has been spent by streamers over the past bunch of years to try to get to that position, how many are going bust and how many smaller sort of studios are going bust, it's kind of crazy. But precisely in this pursuit of profit, it is this risk aversion. And, so in terms of a commodity has to promise oneness and fulfillment. It's impossible to sell a more ambivalent story. So in some ways, I think when this does happen at this point, it's an accident and a miracle. Yeah, I think it's quite a miracle to be able to make a good film these days.
Yeah, that's a good segue, Helen, because I have a lot of questions on the film as such, the medium of film as such. Okay, again, a bit of a naive question. So what is ideological film? As in, is there are there the type of films that give you spurious infinities or false infinities?
Yeah, I think so.
There has to be, I guess, not all film houses contradiction, right? So there has to be certain films that are just what you would say shit films, so.
Well, okay, I think shit films can also be really powerful politically because, you can actually so the repressed contradiction, because contradiction exists. I mean, if you're Hegelian, so I don't know to sort of explicate like this whole thing, but people are maybe like,
I'm Hegelian.
probably like, how do you know this? But anyway, so think about the Big Bang. Like we are born of the contradiction. I mean, read the book. It's kind of like I feel like I often have to like explicate it, and it is true that it is like a huge amount of like groundwork to lay. But let's just say, contradiction exists, and when I think art is art insofar as it is in its various forms, they call cinema the seventh art. So in its various forms, it's able to present an aspect of reality back to us that is more than the sum of its parts and that potentially houses contradiction in a way that we can't just readily grasp by just talking or thinking or, logically speaking or whatever. And it's what makes it so compelling. When that a contradiction is attempted to be overcome, it can really stick out and feel, as you say, shit and really propagandistic. And I think, I used to do a film podcast, and we would analyze like each film as like a cultural product and as like a symptom basically of the material conditions of our moment. And sometimes the best films to talk about are the worst ones, because they're so fruitful. So it feeds back to us something about our experience, and it feels wrong. But I think one of the things that is most, and a friend of mine who is an art critic will appreciate me saying this probably because he really defends the position of the art critic. And I actually am like a people pleaser, and I like to be pleased by people. So I don't like people criticizing my work because I'm a coward. But the thing is, when you look at film criticism today, and it's not surprising given the fact that everybody is so precarious, journalists earn very little and can lose their footing like that. The way things are posted online, you can be attacked in any direction. And often criticism or reviews become not about the work, because in order to be able to have a position on a piece of work that is public, it relies on a sort of level of material security. Otherwise, we have to buy into a corporate logic to sustain our position with our job. And of course, this is understandable that people do this, and we do this all the time in our work. But you see criticism, which is basically a reviewer. They may have not, they may not need to have even watched the film in order to have the opinion, but present their position, their so-called political. And I think the way that politics has come up in the culture is precisely apolitical. So as soon as we, in a reactionary sense, turn to a set of concrete beliefs or cultural signifiers that keep us within our position and sustain this imaginary that there is this perfect enemy behind whom we can, capitalism would function if it only wasn't for them, rather than understanding that politics is precisely always contradictory and to do with the contradictions in ourselves, confronting the contradictions in the other in sort of like the public sphere. And it's very difficult to do politics in capitalism under capitalist logic. But it's more an expression of one's goodness relative to the work than actually what the film's about. So reviews tend to sort of run cover, not only for capitalist logic, because we start to read things and see things in, do I have the right opinion relative to this work? Is this a good film? Is this one made by the baddies? Is this one made by the goodies? And in fact, the world doesn't really work like this at all. And it's actually really damaging to the work, because art, and I think film in particular, I'm biased because I make films, has the capacity to act on us in this emancipatory political way that is stymied not only by a corporate impulse to offer closure, but also to mystify the complexity, the ambivalence of an artwork because of the need to perform certain morals in our very precarious society, and it makes actually making film really difficult, especially when at the point of trying to raise money to make films. Often, as a filmmaker, you have to not only present your work in a problem solution kind of way, as if you can know in advance how the film is going to really be. And the another thing that happens in this risk aversion is there's no novelty, because people who were able to come up at a time when there was more investment and more capacity to be more experimental often have secured a place against this sort of many people who are giving it a go in a society where the alternative to give up on one's dreams is to sort of work in a supermarket or something, which can be very difficult for people to sort of accept. And I'm not saying they should. But what also is quite interesting, and this is something I touch on in the book, is that in terms of the funding model and in production, and in terms of the ideology of film in the film industry, it is really hard to articulate how a misreading of Lacan has come to dominate this world and come to turn the sort of quite magical medium of film away from its emancipatory potential, precisely through the name of the theorist that offers us a route towards that dialectical emancipation.
Yeah, and he's gaze, and how gaze has been
gaze, exactly.
Yeah.
So anybody who's done, an arts degree has heard of this term male gaze, right? Yeah. And it's interesting because there is this kind of long history of psychoanalysis and film. Film emerged at a similar time when Freud, quote unquote, discovers the unconscious. Desire is said to play out in the visual field, and psychoanalysis. It's no surprise that there is this kind of link. Psychoanalysis not only has sort of been used and misused relative to film in terms of, looking at film in terms of what's the hidden meaning, like a detective, what was going on in the mind of the director at the time, when I think actually psychoanalysis in reality is much more to do with something practical.
And material.
And material. And, it's a materialism of the unconscious, but also that this is like the least interesting thing about psychoanalysis. And in fact, psychoanalysis gets you away from thinking in this ideological way. Like, we all want life to be like a detective story. There's something hidden from us contingently that we can unearth, and then we'll learn everything. But the main way in which I think it's Lacanian psychoanalysis has been completely misunderstood in film theory. And I think it's really sad, because to take that name and to present what is offered as Lacanian psychoanalysis relative to film, or psychoanalytic film theory, is like to just completely deny this whole universe of complexity and interest that we could actually bring to the table. But basically, there was a text that became that really caught on, perhaps because of the way in which it turns the quite sort of destabilizing contradiction of psychoanalysis, the uncomfortable, uncomfortable sets of ideas that actually open you up towards the ambivalence of reality, which is quite traumatic. And it sort of turns that contradiction into an oppositional logic and uses the term gaze relative to gender, but basically is transforming Lacanian ideas towards something that's more like Foucault. And Foucault is like a really interesting thinker and really, really important, especially in terms of like the 20th century. And we're looking at, if you're looking at manifest systems of power in the 20th century, that's really important to look at in terms of questions of patriarchy and all this kind of stuff. But, capitalism has done a really good job of eroding that world. And we're in a very, very different moment now that I think Lacan's ideas are maybe more relevant too. But often there is sort of a hierarchy of identity, because when we look at the term male gaze, it's about gaze of power rather than gaze of lack. So gaze is actually the residue in terms of the lack in the other, or the object that we're returning a look back to us and exposing the lack in ourselves. And the way it has been manipulated is to do with certain identities having transcendent subjective power over other identities, and having to wrest that power back to another identity and to look at sort of cultural issues to try to work out political ones, when in reality, in terms of the lie of capitalism and the lie of bad infinity is that there is transcendent power at all. That's the lie, that needs to be defeated by the question of gaze. So it's actually not political enough. It's not left-wing enough. It's not. So, and often when you critique it, it sounds like because it's sort of such a sort of like received idea and it's to do with progressivism or whatever, you can sound, but actually it's far too conservative the way it's been interpreted. And I think that what's most important and where gaze in psychoanalysis is most important is to do with desire, and that film has this capacity as a psychoanalytic practice per se. So I'm much more interested in psychoanalysis in film as psychoanalysis rather than like, oh, let me interpret what was going on in the director's. What does the snake mean? Could it be a penis? It's like, I don't care about that. But actually that as a technology, it puts us in a position, it has the capacity to put us in a position relative to our desire to expose its lack, its contradiction, the gaze of lack in our desire that is universal and that undermines the logic of closure, exception, individualism, which is also the logic of exploitation and subjugation that is in capitalism. Often, as I say, so something that's really important to Hegel is this idea of negating the negation. And Zizek's written very eloquently about this, but this idea of when often what happens in capitalism is a confusion between like the material and the cultural. And as I've said already, the cultural justifications for capitalism is an appeal to false universals, things like meritocracy, freedom, equality under the law and things like that. But capitalism cannot offer that. So for instance, if anybody's been in a court case, not that I have, but it's very obvious that whoever has the most money is going to win if you're going to, go into civil case for whatever. There is no equality under the law, under capitalism. There is no universal when it's not a universal of lack, because capitalism relies on a logic of profit, which means that somebody has to be sacrificed or something has to be sacrificed. It gets us to mobilize our own labor through the promise of oneness in fantasy. So not only are we motivated in different periods of time, so like Mad Men's capitalism, the rise of that form of advertising, which is sort of like a perverse moment where we're told you are lacking this and you desire it. That's a sort of very perverse position in psychoanalysis. So, profit's not working in terms of just getting housewives to buy from a pamphlet that says this appliance will save you time. It has to be like, you're going to be sexy if you get this. You look really ugly compared to Marilyn Monroe, but you can have a bit of Monroe if you have this. But now we're at a time where we have something even more exploitative, where we have this sort of platform, as you mentioned self-help as sort of like individual entrepreneur, logic of exception. You can be, just back yourself. You are the temporarily frustrated SoundCloud rapper. It's funny, I went to this talk about music and capitalism, and it was about, how emancipatory it is that people are in their bedroom making their own music. And I was like, we still have the same corporations running the music industry. This is just a way to get people to, obviously it's like with social media, there's an upside, otherwise we wouldn't participate in it. And often the upside in this one with capitalism is the fantasy. It's really a powerful fantasy to imagine that you're going to be the person it's going to work for, that you're going after your dreams. You couldn't in the past, So instead of capitalism sort of having a society where people are getting wealthier and they have, as Marx points out, space in the day to go fishing and to do art and to do a bit of work or whatever, it's like capitalism promises this sort of progress narrative of you can have more than your parents. Your parents were just working in a shop. Now you can be a superstar. But actually doesn't offer the material conditions where that is actually possible for you, and gets you to auto-entrepreneur yourself without the material reality necessary at your own personal expense. And then sometimes it works for somebody and you think it could be me. And again, like, I'm very pro fantasy. I'm very pro people going after what they want. It's just we have an economic reality that does not match this. And if we want a reality where people can do this, we need to rethink our economy. So, but yeah, this form of capitalism it really encourages this huge amount of backing yourself, auto exploitation, and of course, it's just those corporations that existed already who are profiting from this. The extra labor that people are doing in their bedroom increases the value of those who already have a platform and already have a following and already are part of this sort of capitalist network. So, but film itself, I do think, is one of these miraculous entities in life that comes up, we get these things that, life itself is one of these things, subjectivity itself. There are all sorts of discoveries that can take place, but I think film has this capacity, if it is understood in a certain way. And I think we know it when we see it, but often there are so many forces that prevent this kind of work from seeing the light of day, which is really tragic.
Yeah. So, on that note, Helen, in fact, I got two questions, but first, a bit of the tongue-in-cheek question.
Okay.
And so on page 56, you said it's a bit of a quote here, all right? I'm quoting you back to you. The length and inaccessibility of the psychoanalytic practice is why readily available unconsciousness raising practices such as film might have political worth in terms of the philosophical transformation of wider society. What psychoanalysis might take considerable time, so this is like the session, and money to achieve, film, when understood in terms of the analyst's discourse, might offer as a collective transformance artistic experience, guiding its viewership to an emancipatory insight in small doses. So it's funny, I mean, we're talking about like capitalist logic and all of that. When I read this bit, what I was thinking was, I can't sort of tongue-in-cheek is film like fast food psychoanalysis, like you get like a bit of it in small doses and eventually
a bit of it.
Yeah. I mean, fast food kills.
I don't know if you noticed in the book. Just I don't know if you noticed in the book, I sort of say, might, maybe. I try to like, because even though the film's amazing, like I have to be like, well, I could also, what I'm saying could also just be total nothing idiocy, just because like an auto justification because I make films that I think is really important. But anyway, but it's true. It's like you can't really, as soon as you promise, and of course this is happening with therapy culture, right? So there is this sort of notion that you can be transformed by, we have psychoanalysis, which unfortunately is quite painful and difficult, but but the residue is that one might be able to navigate one's desires in more honest ways, and actually your life is sort of improved in a sort of ordinary unhappiness kind of way. But this is not the kind of promise that therapy culture and self-improvement culture sort of distortedly promise. So you always sort of worry that there's going to be, and in a sense already,
I think they're having,
in terms of this years, and why when it's done properly, it's not commoditizable in the same way as therapy culture. Did I just cut out there?
Yeah, I
or has
think
it been going?
maybe repeat like the past 30 seconds if you could again, please. The connection went a bit off. It was a bit unstable.
Okay, I'll see where. So I'm just going to check, because basically we have internet right here, but if the door's closed, it kind of.
Oh, is that right? I mean, it's fine now. It's been fine the whole time. It's just, it could even be my end. No, my end looks okay.
Yeah, so psychoanalysis, of course, part of the reason why it is not commoditizable is sort of this it's so against the logic of the commodity, which is something can come along and basically the lack in your subjectivity is contingent and can be resolved. And basically psychoanalysis is a gradual unraveling of that logic through the psychoanalytic encounter. And it can take years and years and years. One of the difficulties is that it's very expensive because of that. It can't just be mass produced. It's an experience that doesn't really adhere to a commodity logic that sort of can overproduce this encounter in a commodity. And of course, there's an attempt to do this all the time with sort of, a platform capitalism version of therapy or self-help books and this kind of stuff. But film, and I'm not saying, I think, as I said, that there's all sorts of different ways in which we can have this encounter in reality. Psychoanalysis itself emerges at a moment, I think necessarily because of the suffering that people are experiencing under bourgeois capitalism, the kind of symptoms that emerge as a returned repress of what is denied in that form of logic. So it's sort of a necessary process, but it can also happen. So, and I think there is sort of, this sounds like a really weird way of putting it, but I do think that there's this element of Freud discovering the unconscious and discovering this technique, but that it is possible to have psychoanalytic encounters in all sorts of different ways, in community experiences. I don't know if you've ever done group therapy, is really, really interesting. And obviously it lowers the cost because people are kind of doing it together. But that that film, and potentially it's not going to be as powerful as doing therapy for 10 years. But there are these moments where we can encounter this experience and I think it is just happenstance that we have this technology that's able to do this.
Indeed.
And I think in reality, like Julia Kristeva sort of articulates this really, really well in Hate and Forgiveness, I think, which is to do with the psychoanalytic encounter. She describes you have this transference and countertransference, remembering, forgetting, remembering, forgetting, remembering, forgetting. And this creates this experience of imminent transcendence in life. So we experience, so this is where I sort of really disagree with kind of pure nihilists who are like, life is lacking and life is shit. But I think it's precisely the lack in life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's optimistic in my view.
Yeah, no, they're way too optimistic, way too optimistic. But actually, the lack in life is precisely that which leads us to experience, gives us subjectivity, gives us desire, and leads us to experience life as transcendent. And I think this is the thing. It's precisely the transcendent experience of life that affirms our atheistic universe. But that's a whole other thing to go down. But I think that, it's not about having one insight that lasts us forever, and we're just embracing this sounds really, really rude, but a friend of mine said once that I talking to me was like raw dogging because I'm just too like lack blah blah blah. So I apologize. But anyway, but the thing is, you can't just do this. You have to remember and forget. But so it is enough at times to have these moments of insight. And it's also good to have films that soothe. I think I wrote about rom-coms in this book because anytime that I've been into rom-coms, it's when I've been like really depressed, or like gone through a breakup or something. And this may help you in the short term re-navigate or re-stitch together. You've lost out on the dating front, and you can imagine that it's still worth, and of course, restitching the chain of signifiers in that way is just a way to get depressed again. So I'm not actually in the long term advocating for it, but it is important to have these moments of escape and fantasy and all this kind of stuff. So I think what I'm saying that film offers is just potentially these moments of emancipation. We don't need it all the time, We really might be despaired. We might go completely nuts if we're really confronted with it all the time. But that we can, and I think the thing is the way in which the film can embody this kind of analyst discourse. In many ways, film is sort of supra-rational. You have the music, you have a collective of people watching a film together in the dark. You have the sumptuous lighting and the staging and the acting. In fact, there's a funny sort of weird anecdote, but apparently one of the ways in which we empathize with people is through the movements of our tiny muscles in our face. So when we see somebody, we our face sort of beyond sort of our automatic kind of consciousness reflects or does the movements of the other person's affect and we experience it, which is potentially why in Real Housewives there's so many arguments because they've got so much Botox they can't actually understand each other. So they're just like, but the thing is, the point being, I mean, it's a really sort of facile point, but like this is happening in all sorts of ways in terms of affect, the bodily, you know, it really is going beyond. And I actually am somebody, I think reason is like really important. I'm not one of these sort of like logic is like, I actually did have a phase when I had done too much education. I was a teacher and I was like really into sort of, I became like a really, for a few months, like kind of hippie and was like, nothing means anything anymore. So, but it is, I think, really important to have, you know, reason and all this kind of stuff. But I think that film can put us in this position and open us up in terms of our desire and catch us off guard at this very vulnerable moment where we can almost, you know, caught and embraced by the entire structure of film that is soothing in a way, experiment with lack in our desire in a way that's fruitful and not too confronting.
Yeah,
I think I reckon, yeah.
I mean, I was
The
going to say,
full game in terms of, yeah.
yeah, I was going to add on here, like, I was talking to this, she was, I think still is a psychoanalyst from Perth. And I
Yeah.
spoke to her about a year ago, and she was very adamant about this point that, yeah, when it comes to psychoanalysis, it's never about, like, she never venerated the clinic or,
Mhm.
you know, that kind of the practice. But for her,
Yeah.
religion, as we see, you know, Peter Rollins trying to
Yeah.
put there, you know, I mean, I know he does it in this very novel radical theology kind of way, but I would even say there are certain elements of traditional religion that does house this contradiction. And
I
you
agree.
rightly in the book, you have this section called film as theology. So I do see this thread where you connect even this notion of, yes, it's only a Christian that can become a true atheist. And the logic there is you got to give yourself into it. You know, you got to subjectively invest yourself in the fantasy to see
Yeah.
the inherent lack built into it. And I don't know, I think you're right, because I personally have never been to any kind of therapy, nothing. So like even though I'm deeply interested in psychoanalysis, and maybe I will, maybe I will one day, you know, if I do suffer a lot. I mean, inevitably, perhaps. But I just find that like I don't know, it's hard. I see this. I wouldn't call it transference because that probably is a bit too far, but this where certain experiences in life just expose my
Yeah.
contradiction, my lack, but
Yeah.
also expose kind of what you point out, the contradiction of reality. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, perhaps film is ideal here. Again, in like the Hegelian sense, like it's contingent, but
Mhm.
it seems necessary. Like it's
Yeah.
in the time we're in right now. And another. Sorry, go ahead, Helen.
I was going to say, just to reiterate your point about theology, it's like this is also something that, you know, of course, like I think this is where I'm on the side of Frederick Jameson, because I think obviously capitalism is like totally postmodern. Everything that is sacred is profane. So different, you know, we look at feudal society, obviously it relies on um, religion to keep people in their place and to excuse the suffering of the now for the promise of the future. But I think capitalism relates to religion in all sorts of different ways. And you see, like, you know, in terms of you know, what's happened in various parts of the world relative to American expansion and sort of a reversion to more kind of reactionary forms of religion. You know, there's all sorts of different ways that where it can, people can turn to it as an attempted bulwark from the alienation of capitalism. But one thing that when we get rid of traditions entirely, and we can talk about, you know, what are some of the reactionary dimensions in a lot of religion, there is always in confessional religion a theological aspect, which is a sort of critique of. So you have the fantasy part, the sort of reactionary part, the sort of logic, the totalitarian logic. So um, all can be explained. Lack can be rendered contingent by a form of logic that explicates it. But you also have traditions within confessional religion that critique that aspect of, let's say, a death drive related dimension.
Undoubtedly.
And capitalism, in getting rid of it all, gets rid of that. And so this is what I really like about Peter Rollins' work, is in terms of his version of Christianity being that theological critical part. So, and there's various ways in which that critique can be done. It can be done through logic and reason. But it can also, and you look at sort of in terms of like the rise of certain forms of philosophy throughout the world in all sorts of ways. Often it is in monasteries historically, throughout in all sorts of religious traditions, where philosophy develops, precisely because people who are in monasteries were able to sort of like be protected a little bit because they had their living covered. So, there is this interesting connection between religion, the reactionary forms of religion, and religion as a way to explicate the worst difficulties of life and to prevent a sort of emancipatory confrontation with it. But you also have within confessional religion histories of theology and critique. And capitalism gets rid of all of it. But it doesn't just have to be logic and reason and philosophy that does this. I think anything theological is that which, theological in the critical sense, so theological as in theologizing our subjective desire to believe in the possibility of oneness in alterity. So, and of course we live in this really atheistic age, quote unquote, but often atheism becomes like a new religion in sort of a really basic way. But as Nietzsche points out, the Buddha has died, but the shadow of God is cast on the cave wall for 1,000 years. Lacan points out about, our God is unconscious. We have and this is where, like, I think capitalism is a religion. It's a religion in the sense that it fills this God-shaped hole where we have this sense of lack, and this is this distortion of subjectivity that makes it possible. We are the contradictions of the universe witnessing itself, but we try to overcome that discomfort, that lack, with the promise of something that can come in and fulfill it, but without any of the theological critique of that. And partly because it's so I do think religion needs to be theologized.
Yeah.
And we need to understand that basically the way I see sort of capitalism is we have all these different forms of orders of society which, attempt to mitigate against various aspects of, the society's own contradiction in reality. But capitalism gets rid of everything other than that which promises oneness in fulfillment at the expense of our own life. So I think, like, in a sense, capitalism is death drive at its worst. And capitalism is highly religious in a certain way. But and this is where, I don't believe we live in an atheistic age at all. I think we live in a more reactionary, conservative, religious age without any of the aspects of theologizing it. And the thing is, it's like, I can see why people turn to religion, and it's often the theological parts that they're looking for, in practices, in traditions, in things that get us to be able to tarry with the experience of subjectivity. And in some ways, some aspects of religion are like a shorthand for philosophy, trying to get us to live in ways that are, and as I say, like, humans are very messy, foot-shootery beings, and we get it wrong all the time. So I'm not sort of vouching for any kind of form of confessional religion per se, but there are certain things that is offered by an understanding of the way, and when there is a confessional religion, there is at least a bringing to the surface of this desire structure that we look towards fulfilling with the promise of God, with the promise of the commodity or something like that. Capitalism represses that and pretends it doesn't happen, that we don't have this subjective structure, that we don't believe in commodities in this way, and it's purely rational and there's nothing to think about.
Indeed.
But of course, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Of
No,
course.
that's it basically.
No, I was going to say, because like the whole that what you said about capitalism is religion without theology is brilliant. I couldn't agree more. And I think that itself is the problem, because and that's why, even though, I mean, I still consider myself some kind of a Christian, more Peter Rollins kind, or the kind of death of God Christian. But I would even say, like, I have a lot of friends, I mean, I even sometimes go to church, And yes, there's surely is like the confessional aspects of it, and like even a lot of the churches have been taken up by the logic of capitalism, promising, especially the Pentecostal kind of churches here in Australia
Yeah,
too. I don't
yeah,
mean those big like mega church kind of structures, like even like the smaller churches still do it's I wouldn't say explicitly, but still do bring out this notion of critiquing religion itself, like this kind of,
yeah,
I mean, they talk about sin and the brokenness, the fall, all these notions. Because like in
yeah.
capitalism, you never hear any, and there's no negativity, right? It's like it's this complete like
And
positivity.
if there is a negativity, it's only insofar as it offers you as a commodity that can be understood in a shorthand as potentially possessing knowledge from contingently experiencing lack in a certain way that other people haven't, and you can offer something as a sort of promise of understanding the movements of a world in a certain way. So it becomes a moralism. It becomes a sort of, so if you and often people identify with things that appear to be lack, but it's actually loss
Yeah.
being a contingent thing that can be overcome and not actually to do with the existential nature of reality. So this is where, when people talk about the person as political, what that originally meant is like every subjectivity leads to a universal that speaks to the structure of the universe which capitalism represses. But instead, it can be, it's become this commodity logic of, oh, the terrain of the political takes place just in the individual, and whatever you say goes, or that you as an individual can have the power to transform everything just with your own subjectivity. But or that that there is some promise in certain identities, for instance, rather than the identities being a gateway, and sometimes in very interesting ways, and sometimes people are put in positions that at a moment can be particularly understood in interesting ways that show us something about something that could be emancipatory. But it's not to do with the transcendent nature of one identity, rather subjectivity itself being divided, and that everything being an echo of that reminds us of the structure of the universe that capitalism is at pains to deny. But yeah, it's always cast as loss in capitalism, not actual lack.
Indeed, indeed. Yeah, perfect. All right, Helen, this is my last question. I was gonna ask really in the interest of time, but I was gonna ask this at the outset of the conversation, but I thought it was like a fun note to end on. So
Cool.
bit of a let's say a preamble before the question would be like, so I was listening to this podcast recently, while not recently, probably about 2 or 3 weeks ago, while reading the book, and it was on phenomenology. And so it was
Mm.
great podcast, very informative. And this person, I forget the person's name. I think it was a South American person. But anyway, he was talking about the theories and phenomenology, Husserl, Heidegger, all of this. And then he used children of men to
Oh yeah. Yeah.
demonstrate like in like a to take the theories of phenomenology and to
Yeah.
completely explicate what these theories mean in children of.
Okay.
What's interesting though is, of course, that's not what you're doing in this book. You're not trying to like give the reader a lesson on psychoanalysis. It's not a book on, oh, here are all the concepts in psychoanalysis. So the last question I thought would be a fun little experiment. Now, yeah, we've discussed, you did touch on how they've used, like how Lacan has been misused or misappropriated in
Mhm.
film theory. Um, but perhaps we could take a film. I'm
Yeah.
thinking Citizen Kane because like everyone knows the
Yeah.
film and also
Yeah.
knows this. And maybe kind of walk the listener
Yeah.
through how you would approach, how you would couple
Yeah.
psychoanalytic theory with film
Yeah.
theory to analyze
Okay.
Citizen Kane.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because it's interesting what you say about because often when you have a book about film, it's a book that's like a poetic analysis. And I think I talk about a little bit about how poetics is different from the logic of psychoanalysis, which is metonymic. So
Mm.
metonymy is to do with the chain of signifiers.
Yeah.
So how each individual person, so like a signifier is not a complete, it doesn't have a complete one-to-one relationship with the thing it tries to signify. And this sort of leads us to go off on one essentially in our minds in terms of like where this takes us. And this can be like infinitely explosive in any kind of direction, which is partly why psychoanalysis takes so long. Whereas the logic of poetry is almost like a metaphorical one, which relies on there being a kind of reproduction of meaning in one context and another that can show us something about the other meaning. So it's the logic of psychoanalysis is sort of even more explosive than the logic of poetics, but it kind of can go on for ages, which is partly why it's less prescriptive and it's less sort of to do with what's the meaning here, because the meaning can be so for anybody. But what I try to look at in films is ways in which they happen to, I think, point towards either something about the structure of film itself and how it can confront us with gaze, but how the logic of lack plays out. So it's not necessarily like a philosophical analysis of this means this or whatever. But yeah, so looking at Citizen Kane, and I'm sure lots of people, and in fact, what's quite funny is I've read a few, a lot of Todd McGowan's work, but I don't really watch his videos. But I actually had written this passage on Citizen Kane, and then saw that Todd had a video on it, and he came to like a similar conclusion. But it's not surprising because I think I have a lot of similar tastes to Todd. But anyway, it's interesting that he's a psychoanalysis person interested in film. But so I think Todd is absolutely fantastic. But yeah, I was reassured, I guess, when I kind of wrote this and then saw that he had a similar kind of take. That basically, the way I sort of see Citizen Kane, and part of the reason why it is such a compelling watch, and why so many people list it as one of the greatest achievements in cinema, and partly we see these great achievements as those which capture something about reality that is so difficult to capture, which is the structure of subjectivity. And I think film is so perceived as so magical precisely because it has the capacity to do this. Sometimes people see the magic of film as to do with the spectacle and the realism, and I think realism is important in terms of how it brings us in and captivates us. But I actually think it's, it's such a weird business that you never know what's going to make loads of money in the short term. So people get really sort of caught up in prestige and awards and famous people thinking this is going to be a guarantee of some kind of success for their movie. But I think actually what is really magical and impressive is when a film captures some aspect of the truth of subjectivity in a way that's really moving and impressive, I guess, or just beyond the powers of what we perceive as possible as humans, because film does, it's not only that the other people that you're making films with contribute to the work in a way that you couldn't imagine, and the collection of everybody's input generates something new. It's like the structure of film itself does something that when it's sort of let loose just has this power to capture something about reality. But anyway, so I think it's so captivating because it really does something relative to desire and puts us as viewers in a position relative to our desire, having been so invested in this film. So basically the film is about this guy on his deathbed who was a big media figure. And as far as I remember, because it's been a long time since I've seen it, but there is a journalist. He's a sort of very important media figure who is very mysterious and not much is known about him, but he was a really important figure in society. And this journalist decides to, and basically on his deathbed, he is said to utter this word, rosebud. And nobody knows what it means. And it's interesting how this trope kind of exists in lots of different movies in interesting ways, this sort of empty signifier. But anyway, so which gets us really invested. So it almost like the structure of a detective story. And I think true crime is captivating for people in certain ways, especially people who inhabit a certain subjective position, which is maybe more gendered female, because there's something about being so desired that one can inspire such affect in another that it's kind of really compelling to sort of, but also it's very compelling, the detective, the structure of the detective story, because we feel like we're coming close and discovering a secret. And this is something that really scratches an itch in terms of our subjectivity and desire. So this journalist goes off and interviews all these different people, trying to find out what rosebud means.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of different things we discover about the man, Cain, in all sorts of different ways. I won't go into it, but he never finds out what rosebud means. But this sort of object, this is the object A, you know, it's the lacking signifier which inspires our desire. But we're sort of really captivated by this pursuit, and we want to sort of find out what it means. But the film closes with a scene where it's sort of a flashback, and Citizen Kane is 8 years old, and he's playing in the snow. And basically, it's a day when his childhood ends, and this guy who's entrusted with his sort of education and furtherment in life comes and takes him away and turns him into a man, and he's going to become this great media mogul. And basically, he's playing with a sled, and he's just wrested from this environment. It's almost like a snow globe kind of magical image of childhood, which, you know, we don't know if it's really the reality or if it's just a recalled reality. Of course, in terms of psychoanalysis, like the reason why people are so obsessed with, to put it bluntly, boobs, is because it is this moment of imaginary oneness that we experience before it's taken away from us. And it only becomes this image of oneness. So this moment where we believe we have all of our desires met. We don't know what we desire, and we are given our desire in terms of our primary caregiver, and we are fed and we are soothed or whatever. And it's when this is obviously necessarily, we have to lose the breast to become subjects of language, to become, you know, subjects at all. But Eden becomes Eden insofar as it's lost. So this childhood, we can imagine, it takes on this magical quality because it's been taken away from Cain. But basically, at the end of the movie, loads of Cain's possessions are being put into a pile and put into a furnace. And the final image we see is there's this sledge or sled, as they call it in America, and it's basically chucked in the fire. And the last thing we see is this word rosebud, which is the name of the sled, just burning. So basically, Cain is captivated by this Eden that was lost, which represents in terms of Christianity, right? Subjectivity itself. It's also, in terms of the Breslin psychoanalysis, subjectivity itself is made possible by the loss of Eden.
Yeah.
So basically, it really is rawly exposing this drive of this guy who is driven to succeed and accumulate, which all came back to this lost object of a childhood that was just taken away. And so, firstly, it kind of exposes the way in which the misguidedness of our expectation. We buy into this film believing there's going to be some knowledge about what this means and some secret or what have you. But in reality, it's something really, really mundane, really subjective, to do with a very early experience. And it's kind of nothing. It's a piece of wood.
Yeah.
But also that, I mean, this is sort of an interpretation slightly, that this moment could propel this man to be so driven in a certain way and to attempt to recreate this world, this perfect world that he's lost. So yeah, that's how I would interpret it. I think a lot of Lacanians would probably interpret it that way. I don't think it's a sort of that much of a unique interpretation, really. But I think that film, and it's precisely film that is so good at doing this. And even talking about it, it sort of seems like a quite ephemeral thing because it's like basically nothing. But it's the film itself echoes the story. So the structure of the film echoes the story in that we only experience as transcendent this nothing precisely because this huge edifice has been built around it. And this edifice is precisely the result of the nothing.
Indeed.
And I think, it's very similar to The Wizard of Oz, which I think is like one of the greatest. I mean, it's interesting because it wasn't originally a movie, but it like captivated people as a movie. And I think it's like just this incredible work of psychoanalysis, basically.
What animates the film really is this pursuit or the the character's journey of the pursuit for the nothing. And then, as you say, that's kind of what animates our lives too, through fantasy. Beautiful. Now, thank you, Helen. That was really helpful. I think because, like, we talk of like this book in no way is like a very abstract book. It's a very, it's like brevity, succinct, clear, concrete. And I
Okay,
think
that's
part of,
good.
part of that is because, again, because of the medium of cinema, like because you're using
Yeah,
films to explain the structure, and you aren't just talking in abstract theory. But this was really useful for perhaps for as an impetus for the listeners to read the book, because that's kind of what the whole book is about. You take a film and you kind
yeah,
of break it down and show the structure and how it
yeah.
relates to lack, contradiction, and everything we discussed. Yeah, thank you very much, Helen. It's been lovely, and it's been great reading it. And I'm looking forward to yeah, the upcoming projects. I mean, writing projects. But on the note, what's as a
Yeah.
filmmaker, what's currently in the pipeline?
Yeah, so I mean, it's actually talking about like the nature of capitalism today. It's been the most difficult year I think. So I've been making films for 10 years, and it's been the
Yeah,
most difficult year, just because I mean, I can really go into why it's happened, but that would be really boring in terms of like British economic policy and stuff like that. But anyway, so it's pretty hard. But there's two features I'm working on. One is a documentary about a friend of mine who passed away after we started making the film, who is one of the longest surviving people in the world with AIDS, and he was
activist. Yes,
yeah, a really interesting figure who was a religious figure, and his life sort of concretizes a lot of contradictions of the 20th century in a really interesting way. So it's that sort of it's a very low budget, almost elegy to the sky, but also looking at desire in the 20th century. I think kind of interestingly.
Sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt, but is the GoFundMe still open for the public? Because I
Do you
can.
know what? I think I can change a setting for people to like continue to donate, and I should probably do that.
Right.
But
Yeah. I mean, I'll leave it at
they're probably going to be a bit long. That's really, really great, because I think it's going to be, I was hoping to have it finished sooner rather than later, but life experience circumstances are kind of, it's going to be a bit longer, so it'll be into the next year that we keep making it. And then another film that I actually wrote 10 years ago, but I'm really thrilled to say that we're actually we have started to film a little bit of it, but it's kind of an experimental film. But it's a contemporary reinterpretation of The Outsider by Camus,
yeah.
set in contemporary Belfast. But basically, one of the things that we're kind of doing is playing with the form, because obviously what's interesting with the film, with the book, sorry, is that it's this first person confessional narrative recalling a series of events. But in terms of adaptation, it's been adapted once before. And actually, I think the family, I could be wrong, don't quote me on this, of the novelist had a lot of creative control. And it really doesn't work as a movie. It's a movie from the 60s, because you really have to have a main character that is investable in. And if you don't actually work with something, some people really don't like voiceover. I really fucking love voiceover, so blah. But if you don't have this voiceover aspect, it's really hard for people to identify with a character that's so flat. So we've kind of transformed the book into a sort of fake documentary, a documentary being made about the series of events that took place with this guy in terms of the killing that he took part in, and his own reflection upon it. And but it's all to do with meta narrative, and in fact, and social media, and the response of the collective to a series of events that seem contingent to somebody as they're going through it. So it's kind of playing with form to kind of expose that. But also I think it's quite psychoanalytic, because it's about the encounter between the filmmaker and the main character. And we're going to we filmed some of it, because we're filming like the reenactment part, which is like a reenactment of the guy's confession. And then later down the line, we're kind of gonna, but yeah, no, I think it's what I kind of appreciate also about film is, like with any medium, you get so far invested in it that it kind of can take you in all sorts of different directions, and you can mess with the medium in all sorts of different ways. So I really kind of like to do that. And one of the things that has been quite fun as an independent filmmaker, because I've kind of worked in film in different roles and stuff, and I sort of prefer making film independently on sort of small budgets, which obviously comes with like real constraints. But sometimes the creative constraints are the sort of thing that the constraints lead to creativity.
Mhm.
So yeah, but excited about making that. And then always, taking on all sorts of projects to pay the bills.
Love
So,
it, love it. Yeah, yeah. Well,
yeah.
who knows? Maybe it might be like I forget the Japanese Hamlet. Zizek says that uh, I forget which I think which director it was, but the one Hamlet that was done in Japan, that Hamlet was the it retroactively gave Shakespeare's original Hamlet, even so-called original Hamlet, even more meaning, as in it was the
Yeah.
real Hamlet happened in Japan in 1950s. So probably this could happen with Camus' book, where the film
Well,
is.
it's interesting because I have a lot of critique of Camus. Like I love Camus, but like I have a lot of critique as a sort of more Lacanian Hegelian
Hmm,
of that existential stuff. But I think that novel is just amazing.
it is, it is. Yeah, I
And
read.
yeah.
Yeah, it certainly did. Yeah, one of the best books I've read. I remember one of the first like real meaty philosophy books I read as a kid, and it really, I don't know, it was good. Yeah, it really does capture you. I think, and
It
also
is
I
amazing
think
how it
as
like opens you up. Yeah. In
yeah,
a
and
way, I think at a certain age you come across it and it's like, yeah.
you make a good point. I think a part of it is because it's like the character's first person account. It's
Yeah.
a different kind of book, and that helps because you know what the character is going through. But yeah, thank you very much for this conversation and the book, Helen. It's lovely, and yeah, it's been a delight. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. I'm glad you thought it was clear because I also wasn't sure. Like I wrote a first pass of it and I've never done a book like this before. And I was like, kind of like, do I keep it kind of more abstract? Because then I can't be told off if people don't like it. And then I decided to make it more like concrete because I do actually believe in like clarity and stuff. But then I was like, shit, no, I should have made it more ephemeral. I don't know. But anyway,
No, no, no. I
it
mean,
is what it
or
is.
perhaps in like if you made it a bit more ephemeral, then in the objet where you're like, oh, what the dust thing? What is
I
she trying
know.
to
That's what I sort of think
that thing?
I maybe like destroyed it in that way. But anyway, oh
Still,
well.
I'll leave a link in the show notes for the
Great.
listeners. But again, thank you very much for your time, Helen, and yeah, thanks again for the second conversation. I've learned a lot, and it's been lovely.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Cheers.